Started. As you can see, the meeting is being recorded.
Hi.
So if you have any questions about that, if you want to turn off your camera, that's fine, but we are recording. So good afternoon. Welcome to Beyond Public Polemics, Reconsidering the Wright-Baldwin Relationship, its reception and its contemporary relevance, and what we hope will be a lively conversation kicked off by two short presentations. My name is Deborah Mutnick, and I'll be moderating today along with Ali Arant and Joe Ramsey. I'm a professor of English at Long Island University in Brooklyn, New York, a block away from the prison ship Martyrs Monument in Fort Greene Park, where Wright drafted much of Native Son on yellow legal pads. The Richard Wright Circle was initially convened by Mary Emma Graham and Jerry W. Ward Jr. in 1991, with charter members that included Margaret Walker, Samuel Allen, Michelle Fabre, Donald Gibson, Joyce Ann Joyce, Kenneth Kinnaman, George Lamming, Jan Mohammed, Eleanor Traylor, and Julia Wright. The group became inactive apparently around 2006, although the archives of their work can be found at Kansas University. In 2022, Ali Arant, the host of this meeting, reached out to the American Literature Association for information about the Richard Wright Circle, and eventually got in touch with Mariana Graham, who has helped us figure out the backstory of the Richard Wright Circle. The ALA executive director, Alfred Ben-Dixon, meanwhile, encouraged Ali to put out a call for papers for ALA 2022 to launch a new Richard Wright Society. And it is this newly revived group, which you're welcome to join if you haven't yet, that is sponsoring today's event. As you probably know, because it's been so highly publicized, 2024 marks the 100th birthday of James Baldwin on August 2nd. Richard Wright's birth date also just passed on September 4th. He was born in 1908. You may also know that even though Wright mentored Baldwin and helped him out in his early career, Baldwin published an essay, Everybody's Protest Novel, in 1949 in Paris, that described Native Son as, quote, a continuation, a complement of that monstrous legend, Uncle Tom, it was written to destroy. Later in life, Baldwin expressed regret for this characterization of the novel and the author, but the evaluation has persisted ever since. I had the pleasure in 2014 of interviewing Jake Lamar, an African-American expatriate living in Paris. At the time, Lamar, the author of Bourgeois Blues, an American memoir, and a former associate editor for Time magazine, had already had a reading in French of his play, Brothers in Exile, about Wright, Baldwin, and Chester Himes. Inspired by real people and real facts, the play is fictional, revolving around Wright's death and an official inquiry by the French authorities into Himes and Baldwin's potential involvement. Lamar invents circumstances for the three authors built on the information he gleaned from reading work by and about them. I'd like to set the scene for today's discussion of the two authors' often fraught relationship and their contemporary reception and relevance by reading a short excerpt from Lamar's play set at Les Deux Magots Café. So there are three versions of this scene where the encounter takes place, and this is Baldwin's version. Right. Hey, boy, Baldwin. Bonsoir, mes amis. Right, you remember Chester Himes. Baldwin, yes, of course. How are you, Chester? Himes, fine, thanks. Baldwin, so, Richard, I heard you were angry with me. Right, about what? That treacherous bullshit you wrote about Native Son? Now, why should I be angry about that? Baldwin, so it's true what I've heard. Listen, you have to understand, I was in my way honoring your work. Himes, how do you figure that? Baldwin, Richard, my critique takes your work very seriously, putting it in an important historical literary context, removed from all the contemporary hullabaloo. You need someone like me to point out both the responsibilities and the hazards you've taken by producing such significant work. You shouldn't be against me. You should be patting me on the back. times. The kid has a point. Right. Pats Baldwin on the back, pours him a glass of wine. Fair enough, Jimmy. But you're dead wrong when you attack protest literature. What do you mean protest? All literature is protest. You can't name a single novel that isn't protest. Baldwin, yes, all literature is protest, but not all protest is literature. Right. Oh, please don't give me that art for art's sake crap. Baldwin, what I'm trying to say, Richard, is that you and I are as different as two writers can be. We are joined only by our roots. Right. Roots? What roots? Next thing you'll be telling me, all colored folks have rhythm. So I'll end there. We'll hear from our two wonderful presenters today, who I'm going to introduce. And then we'll have an open conversation that I hope will be very exciting. So we first have Donald Kizza-Brown, who was born and raised in Vicksburg, Mississippi, a place Wright often visited as a child. He attended Mississippi State University before going abroad to the University of Oxford for his master's degree and then Harvard for his PhD. Under the mentorship of Henry Louis Gates and Cornel West, he wrote a dissertation that explored novels that represented 20th century Black Southerners organizing on farmland during a time when so many African Americans were migrating elsewhere. He is currently a postdoctoral fellow at Brown University, where he's turning his dissertation into a book and writing a biography of Richard Wright, which I am really, really eager to read. William J. Maxwell is the Fannie Hurst Professor of American Literature at Washington University in St. Louis, where he has taught modern American and African American literature since 2009. He's the author of the books FBI's, How J. Edgar Hoover's Ghost Readers Framed African American Literature, published by Princeton University Press in 2015, which won an American Book Award, and New Negro, Old Left, African American Writing and Communism Between the Wars, Columbia University Press, 1999. He is the editor of several collections on James Baldwin and Claude McKay, including most recently with Gary Holcomb, McKay's previously unpublished novel, Romance in Marseille. Maxwell was the president of the International Modernist Studies Association and has served on the Modern Language Association divisional committees on both Black American and 20th century American literatures. A former book review editor of African American Review and member of the editorial board of American Literature, he is now contributing editor at PMLA, American Literary History, and James Baldwin Review. And I'll just say one more thing before turning it over to Donald. We will end officially at 1:30, so if you have to get off, that's a good time to leave. But we're happy if the conversation is really vibrant and you want to continue, we're happy to stay on until, I'm losing track of time, 2 o'clock.
Yeah.
No, yeah, 3 o'clock.
Sorry, 3 o'clock. Yeah, we're shifting
We're
time
in
zones
the
here.
Midwest and we're on the East Coast until 3 o'clock Eastern time. So Donald, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Deborah, for that generous introduction. And it's an honor to be speaking to you all. I've read a lot of Bill's work, and just looking at the Zoom, I've read quite a few books and articles by people who are listening in. So it's pretty cool to have you all listen to me now. So I'll get started. I wrote my first essay on Wright's relationship with Baldwin and Ellison when I was 20 years old at Mississippi State University, my alma mater, for an honors college symposium. Looking back on it, it wasn't the best presentation ever, but it was heartfelt. At its core, it came down to this simple question: why did Ellison and Baldwin turn on the man who mentored and helped them so much? I argued that conservative Cold War pressures led them to make Wright a scapegoat, someone whose radical critiques of the nation they needed to deny in order to cozy up with the white liberals, literary gatekeepers, etc. I still, for the most part, believe that to be true, but what I'm interested in discussing today, very briefly, is a troubling response, or at least it was troubling to me, I got from a professor at Mississippi State. During Q&A, he told me that it could all be explained in terms of Harold Bloom's theory, known as the anxiety of influence, based on Freud and Oedipus. Quote, they needed to slay their literary father to carve creative spaces for themselves, end quote, he said, with an air of confidence that embarrassed me. I had never even heard of Bloom. Though I was sincere in my questions and concern over their betrayal, That professor had put me in my place, told me I shouldn't take that betrayal of Wright so personally. What I thought was deep and worthy of considerable study could be explained by a theory I had never heard of, but should have. It was a standard part of Western literary tradition. Though I've got a PhD now, I still don't understand Bloom's argument as well as I should. I fake like I do when I have to. It's probably rooted in the many times white theories were deployed in a way that separated me from my way of knowing and communicating. I may not know Bloom's work as well as I should, but I know how working class Black communities of artists would receive such a theory. I've talked to a number of them about it. No Black community that I've ever been a part of would take too kindly to slaying Black fathers, not physically or metaphorically. Even if there is merit in Bloom's analysis, which I don't doubt there is, it will never be received as he intends for it to be in the communities I come from and the communities I fight hard not to forget, despite my academic training in elite white spaces. Perhaps Bloom's classic wasn't written to me. It probably wasn't intended for me. All I know that his influence, Black influences, do not make me or the working class Black artists I know anxious. We are hungry for them, looking for positive influences, Black fathers and Black mothers, whom we are rarely taught in our formal education to help guide us. We are desperate for them, as desperate as I was when I found out a Black man from my home state of Mississippi named Richard Wright had become one of the most skilled writers to ever step foot on earth. And he got it out of the mud like I was trying to do when I first encountered him in junior high school. It changed everything for me. It changed everything for me like it changed everything for Wright when he first met Shorty. If you've read Black Boy, I'm sure you remember Shorty, an elevator operator in Memphis, his first literary mentor. Or when he later met Arna Bontemps and Langston Hughes in Chicago when they saw him out in 1934 after they heard his poetry was making a stir in communist magazines. Wright eventually began going to Bontemps' house every Sunday in Chicago to discuss the short stories that later became Uncle Tom's Children. He sought his advice, asked for feedback, and was grateful for an older Black man that took the time to teach him. Wright later joined the Harlem Cultural Congress with Hughes and others when he moved to New York in 1937. Wright was also later mentored by George Padmore, who trained him in Pan-African thought when he moved to Paris in the late 1940s. Wright would keep up with each of them until their death or his, seeking their advice, grateful for their influence on his career. Wright had his share of sons from across the diaspora too. Owen Dotson from Brooklyn, Magu Gatherer from Kenya, and Peter Abrams from South Africa. Unlike Baldwin and Ellison, they didn't write scathing criticisms of his work. I sometimes wonder why Wright's controversial relationship with Baldwin and Ellison is emphasized so much more than the less controversial ones he had with other fathers and sons. Is it because Baldwin and Ellison are famous too, or because a critical mass of scholars and gatekeepers would rather focus on Black people tearing each other apart, as Ellison depicted in his famous Battle Royale scene? Black writers like Wright's metaphorical father, Arna Bontemps, and metaphorical son, Owen Dotson, could be just as famous as Wright, Ellison, and Baldwin if producers of knowledge wanted them to be. They were just as talented, just as prolific, if you ask me. Wright's loving friendships with Dotson and Bontemps could be just as discussed and entrenched in the American literary canon if we wanted them to be. So too, could we discuss Wright's relationship with Baldwin and Ellison before the beef more, if we wanted to. Baldwin first laid eyes upon Wright while he worked as a waiter in Calypso in 1943, but it's doubtful that they ever talked to each other. Baldwin worked there as a busboy and waiter. Wright would go there to meet up with his good friend, C.L.R. James, and other Black radicals who went to Calypso to discuss art and politics over Caribbean food. It wasn't until 1945 when, based upon a friend's recommendation, Wright invited Baldwin to his Brooklyn apartment so he could read part of his novel in progress. It was then called Crying Holy, but he eventually changed it to Go Tell It on the Mountain. Baldwin recounted that meeting in an essay, Alas, Poor Richard. Richard brought out a bottle of bourbon and ice in glasses, but Baldwin did not know how to drink back then and was terrified that the liquor on my empty stomach would have the most disastrous consequences. Baldwin met Wright's wife, Ellen, only briefly when she made an appearance near the evening's end. For the rest of the night, she was, quote, somewhere in the back with the baby, end quote. Most of their meeting was strictly business. quote, Richard talked to me, or rather, drew me out on the subject of the novel I was working on then, end quote. Baldwin listened diligently to Wright while also being terribly anxious and afraid that he would fall out of the chair. He desperately wanted Wright to be interested in him. Baldwin told him more about the novel than he actually knew about it, madly improvising, rambling on about all the things which cluttered up my mind. Looking back on it all in the essay in 1960, Baldwin was convinced that Wright saw right through him, but was also pretty sure Wright did not judge him harshly and liked him. He agreed that night, to Baldwin's great relief, to read the 60 or 70 pages he had done on the novel, and he would send them back to him as soon as he could. Baldwin mailed them to him as soon as possible, and Richard commented very kindly and favorably on them. Ultimately, Wright encouraged him to apply for the Eugene Saxton Fellowship and wrote him a letter of recommendation, which Baldwin was awarded later that year. I've never read a paper on Wright's influence on Go Tell It on the Mountain. It's a piece of scholarship that deserves to be written, particularly considering Wright wrote a novel eerily similar to it in the mid-1930s, Tar Baby's Dawn, that is yet to be published. Despite the misconception that their literary aesthetics are starkly different, Wright's hands are all over Baldwin's novel, at least in my opinion. Though Wright's novel is still unpublished, his legacy of a tender depiction of a young Black male adolescent lives on through Baldwin's classic. What happened after? Baldwin's scathing reviews of Wright, even after Wright helped him move to Paris, Wright's understandable anger towards Baldwin, and their inability to ever make up after that, I would say, for the Q&A. Looking back on it all, in a 1977 interview with Nikki Giovanni, Baldwin expressed regret over his fallout with Richard Wright. He told her that he finally realized what he owed to Richard Wright, but admitted, quote, he could not see that when he was 20, end quote. What does one generation of Black writers, Black people, owe to the next? What do a people cut off from each other due to the Atlantic slave trade and its aftermath owe each other? These are questions Wright thought about a lot. In the early 1940s, he dedicated a whole multi-volume series, tentatively titled Voyage and Never Completed, which would span centuries and continents, was all concerned with this question. In an unpublished novel he was working on until he died, Island of Hallucination, he addresses these questions directly in the character of Ned Harrison, who advises the main character, Fishbelly. Quote, our race has no memory, end quote, Ned tells Fishbelly. Each generation lives as though no one has lived before it. What my father learned from his living died with him. You can't blame your father if he died and left you poor. Maybe he had no chance to control the economic forces that shaped his destiny. But damn it, we can blame our fathers for dying and leaving us ignorant of what they encountered in life, what they felt about it, end quote. It was his generation's duty, Ned states, quote, to try to establish that continuity of experience that makes me talk to you like this, end quote. I don't know what Baldwin or Ellison owed Wright in return of anything for his help or guidance, but I don't think it's too much to ask Baldwin to, at the very least, have read his work on Wright's own terms, which I think Baldwin failed to do in Many Thousands Gone and Everybody's Protest novel. Native Son is a brilliant work of art that, among other things, demonstrates the impact of PTSD upon a young Black man whose father died in a riot in Mississippi before the family migrated to Chicago, a young Black man that left Mississippi to live in deplorable kitchenette conditions in Chicago's South Side. Long before Dr. Bessel van der Kolk taught the nation that the body keeps the score, Wright was telling readers precisely that with vigor, for those willing to read closely, for those who dared to read Wright on his own terms, which include Wright's lifelong interest in the mental health of traumatized Black migrants. We owe it to Wright to not only read Wright's work in conversation with the mentees who became some of his harshest critics. We owe it to Wright to read his work in conversation with sons and daughters who appreciated his work, to those who, in Wright's own words, sought to establish a continuity of experience that would leave his race, his people, with memories that slavery, Jim Crow, and mass incarceration all seek to destroy. I will end with what Owen Dotson said about Wright. It's a relationship that deserves more attention. When Dotson was asked to contribute to the book Richard Wright, Impressions and Perspectives, published in 1973, he allowed the editors to publish letters Wright sent him, and he wrote an essay on how much Wright meant to him. Dodson and Wright first corresponded in 1937. One of Dodson's stories was published in the first and only issue of a small Black literary magazine, New Challenge, which Wright co-edited. By that point, Dodson had already earned his BA from a prestigious liberal arts college in Maine, Bates College, and would go on to earn an MA in playwriting from Yale 2 years later. For over 20 years, he taught at Howard University with other stints at other universities while publishing plays, poetry collections, and novels. Dodson and Wright didn't meet in person until 1940, when Wright was living on Grand Avenue in Brooklyn, newly married to Ellen Wright. He had a basement apartment, and in the back was a yard, Dodson remembered. He was learning how to grow things then. I think it reminded him of his roamings in the field and farms of his native Mississippi. That was Wright's main hobby outside of writing, reading everything he could about raising vegetables, flowers, and all varieties of plants and fruits. Dodson said Wright took immense joy in learning, quote, things he was never able to study in school, end quote. He took just as much joy, if not more, Dodson remembers, in helping younger Black writers like him get published and get paid. And I'll end with a long quote here by Dodson from a letter he wrote. I can say he was one of the warmest and most generous and gentle writers I have ever met. He was never jealous of someone else's work. He criticized with forthrightness, which never had an edge of jealousy to discourage, especially young writers. He was generous in recommending his publishers to them, and especially urging them to be forthright about the truth of the lives that they lived and saw about. So many times when I was invited to his apartment on Charles Street in the Village, he was surrounded by people who came from various parts of the world and made a special point of visiting him because they so admired what he had done to reveal the life of the Negro, end quote. Up until Wright's dying days in Paris, Dodson remembered Wright asking him over the phone, quote, what the kids are doing in the world of arts and letters, what the young people are doing to reshape the crooked outlines that were so falsely and ruthlessly drawn to give America her pragmatism. And I'll end there with Dodson quote, and I look forward to now hearing Bill's comments, and then we'll open it up to everybody else. Thank you all for listening.
So hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay, and thanks for coming on a Saturday where you really should be outside somewhere. But anyway, speaking of what the young people are doing in the world of arts and letters, it's a pleasure to meet Donald, and I expect we'll be hearing a lot more from him and his work. And it's great to see so many of you here whose work I know, who I've met back and forth over the years. I do, if you indulge me just a second, I want to give a special shout out to one of the scholars who's here, Alan Wald, who has altered for the better the history of American literary radicalism more than any single person, I think, certainly in my lived experience and my sense of the history of the field. And when I was Donald's age, Alan Wald took my materials very seriously, read them fully and supportively, but with deep and important critique. And I realize now how rare that is, how rare it is to have a true mentor who's dedicated to helping reproduce the history of the field through younger scholars. So I just want to say thank you to Alan and for his work. There he is. Okay. Hello. Okay, so I don't take up the whole time. I've got about 6.5 pages, same length as Donald. I'm going to talk about Wright v. Baldwin, Wright with Baldwin in a different way, in that I'm going to try to triangulate this famous debate in relationship to Ta-Nehisi Coates. And after writing this a while ago, I realized that Joe Ramsey has also written an important piece on this that you should check out, which is online. But here goes. This is an attempt to think about the ways in which Baldwin's revival has, ironically enough, allowed us to make peace with Richard Wright. So anyway, here we go. Ta-Nehisi Coates' variation on the theme of James Baldwin shows a mixed appetite for the 21st century Baldwinisms before his. Like them, he applauds the public political witness of Baldwin's art, but breaks with the best part of the pack in his silence about Baldwin's bravely public queerness. What moves Coates most of all in Baldwin is evidence of upfront racial militancy. Contrary to Cornel West's caustic attack on Coates's 2015 bestseller, An Instant Classroom Standby, Between the World and Me, his Jimmy is a chronic speaker of Black truth to state power. Even before Coates settled on revising The Fire Next Time in his own autocritical book, however, he took his wife Kenyatta Matthews' advice and selected Baldwin as a beacon of straight-talking race radicalism. Coates's first meeting with President Barack Obama at an off-the-record session with liberal journalists in 2013 left him disappointed in himself, reports Benjamin Wallace Wells. Everyone was deferential, and I was too deferential too, Coates regretted. The second time he was asked to visit Obama's White House, he came loaded with a bracing, officially sacrilegious question, namely, what would Baldwin do? Akin to the bracelet, what would Jesus do? Baldwin, Coates determined, would do as he did in his increasingly legendary meeting with Bobby Kennedy and advance the least conciliatory ideas in the room. Coates thus quizzed Obama on the racial politics of universal health insurance, not as universal as planned under the Republican governors who opted out of Obamacare's expansion of Medicaid. Why, Coates demanded, wouldn't Obama take more targeted action to counter this, talking race as well as class? Why, moreover, had Obama suggested during a speech on the 50th anniversary on the March on Washington that many African Americans had lost their way in the aftermath of the civil rights movement, failing to accept adequate responsibility for thwarted dreams? Wasn't the president blaming the victim, fetishizing culture over structure, and risking a forgiveness of white sins not even the Reverend King had contemplated? Unlike Bobby Kennedy, stung and brooding after Baldwin's walkout of another off-the-record sit-down in 1963, Obama waited for Coates after their second meeting and pulled him aside for counseling. Don't despair, Obama advised. Hope dictated against it. But hope was not what Coates prized in Baldwin. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, the covertly complementary poles of the struggle, impressed Coates as cohorts linked by Afro-optimism. People say Malcolm was a pessimist, Coates has commented, yet he was actually very optimistic. Malcolm very much believed in the dream of nationalism. He believed we could do it. Martin believed no less, trusting the moral witness of African Americans could realize the freedom dream of integration and equality. Coates did not share their optimism about Black power, also the faith of his father, his own father, William Paul Coates, a Black Panther turned librarian and independent publisher, and he believed that Baldwin didn't either. A peer and survivor of Malcolm and Martin, Baldwin was dead set against sentiment and melodrama, Coates surmised, whether in the gone world of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Manichaean abolitionism or in the embers of the modern civil rights movement. His approach was just so cold, and this is Coates's language. Baldwin was saying, you should be aware that failure was a distinct possibility. Now, cold is not a word normally associated with Baldwin's way of saying. Impassioned, even overheated, are much more common. All the same, a cool, existentially open uncertainty is what Coates senses in The Fire Next Time. It's thunderous and indefinite concluding sentences, once the most famous Baldwinisms of all. And I'll read a couple of these, though I bet you know them. You may have memorized them. You may have a tattoo. I'm not certain, but here they are. If we, they read, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of the others. Do not falter in our duty now. We may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. If we do not now dare everything, the fulfillment of that prophecy, recreated from the Bible in song by a slave, is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign. No more water, the fire next time. Now, rightly or wrongly, I think largely wrongly, these sentences were sort of extracted from the entire canon of Baldwin's work and made to be something like his official motto in the late 1960s by some younger Black radicals. But in any case, these are powerful sentences, and certainly Baldwin worked hard on them to be so. Anyway, about these sentences, there are two ifs in these exacting final lines, and a pair of relativelies, and a halting, self-divided rhythm to home in on. There's a prophecy of fire, previously remediated by the book of Genesis, by enslaved Black poets, in whose light Baldwin looks nothing like the groveling, self-effacing lover of white oppressors detected, for instance, by Eldridge Cleaver. When Coates asked his editor, Chris Jackson, why no one wrote like Baldwin anymore, this was a while ago. Everyone writes like James Baldwin now. He was asking in part why no one since had so stirringly proposed that the failure of the African-American freedom struggle was a systematically favored possibility. Coates was also asking why more living Black writers hadn't borrowed the Fire Next Time's compact form, a short, powerful, and singular 100-page burst of essay, memoir, history, and alarm. Between the World and Me tried this form on for size, that's the Coates book, adding modestly to the page count, but keeping Baldwin's logical concision and epistolary frame. Baldwin had crafted the first shorter section of The Fire, originally published in the New Yorker, My Dungeon Shook, as an open letter to his 14-year-old nephew, James, public correspondence observing the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation, its promise unsecured in 1963. Coates addressed the whole of Between as a letter to his son, Samori, marking the viral parade of Black death he'd been compelled to watch in 2014, his 15th year. This is the year you saw Eric Garner choked to death for selling cigarettes, the year in which Renisha McBride was shot for seeking help at a white man's front door, the year most painfully when Samori learned that the killers of Michael Brown would go free during a rambling televised press conference. That press conference took place 5 miles from where I'm sitting right now. The men, policemen who had left Brown's body in the street like some awesome declaration of their inviolable power, would never be punished. An adequate penalty for these men, Coates recognized, was beyond his power, but he could adopt the family romance of Baldwin's letter to pass down the shielding counter-wisdom of Black Lives Matter, built on second-wave feminist body politics, addressing sexual violence and reproductive freedom. Black lives mattered and were made of matter, this wisdom taught. Racism was lived like the experience of misogyny, body by body. It was not an abstract injustice, but an intimate, visceral experience. A parent's fear for a child's embodied life, what beyond one's own skin was more visceral, captured racism's carnal core. Baldwin reminds his nephew that he is a spiritual aristocrat, the heir of a long line of poets, some of the greatest poets since Homer, who possessed the soul power, S-O-U-L power, to force his white brothers to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing from reality and begin to change it. Coates, by contrast, implores his son to forget poetry and concentrate on racism's sociology. He uses that term, which is obviously a very sort of pregnant and loaded term in the Wright-Baldwin debate. And by the way, Wright does enter this, I promise. The better to see the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions aimed at his mortal form. There's pleasure in Coates's careful and vigorous language, as he flavors it, for example, the cloying aura of the TV suburb, quote, smells like peppermint, but tastes like strawberry shortcake, end quote. Toni Morrison called this language more linear and consumable than Baldwin's dutifully redemptive in her Dream blurb. Yet Coates warns Samori that most of his white brothers are beyond poetic deliverance, and that even fighting words like white supremacy blur the bottom line. In the raw, racism dislodges brains, this is Coates, blocks airways, rips muscle, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must never look away from this. Coates appears to look away from Baldwin in his title and opening epigraph. The latter is taken from a long poem by Richard Wright, also titled Between the World and Me, first published in 1935. The work of this poem, confronting the human debris of a barbaric lynching and reintroducing historical materialism to the physical kind, chimes with Coates's command to keep his son staring. Wright's sooty corpse, thrusts itself between the poem's speaker and his capacity to know the world otherwise. The burned thing, and that's Wright's language, becomes a speck in his eye, ensuring a lasting afterimage of racism's fleshly toll. What the plentiful study guides to Between the World and Me sometimes miss, however, is that Coates's title phrase also appears in Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. Joe did not miss this, by the way. Okay. In the early autobiographical going of Letter from a Region to My Mind, Letter from a Region in My Mind, Baldwin faces the shadowy fear communicated by his parents whenever he unknowingly crossed a boundary guarded by white power. The Black child, Baldwin generalizes, does not know what the boundary is, and he can get no explanation of it, which is frightening enough. But the fear he hears in the voices of his elders is more frightening still. A Harlem summer on the cusp of adolescence was the season in which this fear, now a part of him, and this is Baldwin's language, and the ruler of his vision of the world, rose up like a wall between the world and me, and drove me into the church. The thing of Baldwin's terrors, the counterpart of Wright's lynched body, had assumed an emotional shape. It was like a wall, but immaterial. And this fear-made entity demanded that he look away from the solid furnishings of Harlem's unspiritual world and see again through the purifying lens of Black Christianity. We're almost there, folks. The Fire Next Time proceeds to rake this Christianity and all other branches of the faith over the coals of a disastrous institutional history. Whoever wishes to become a truly moral human being must first divorce himself from all the prohibitions, crimes, and hypocrisies of the Christian church, Baldwin pontificates. Wright, as much a born atheist as Coates, would ratify this indictment, yet the difference between Wright's world and me and Baldwin's remains wide. Unlike his one-time literary father, the Baldwin of The Fire Next Time is a reluctant materialist, an ex-Christian, emphasis on both sides of the hyphen, who anchors his opposition to the church in existentialist ethics and a queered gospel of love. This is not a difference that Coates respects. His title's double salute to Wright and Baldwin reveals something crucial about his vein of recent Baldwinism. Baldwinism is this term I'm using in this book I'm trying to write on the intellectual history of the Baldwin revival to represent all the ways in which the present has made Baldwin over again as the most representative 20th century Black author. So I'm just calling that Baldwinism. All right. And I think that, the salute that Coates gives to both Wright and Baldwin reveals something about Baldwinism. It's quick to blunt Baldwin's formative quarrel with Wright, guilty, as the Parisian Baldwin saw it, of equating literature and sociology and other inert objects safely ensconced in the social arena. In Between the World and Me, the debate between Coates's two literary ancestors is quietly resettled in Wright's philosophical favor. Coates' testament to The Fire Next Time occupied the attention of his publicists, and it's Baldwin's name, invoked by Toni Morrison, that decorates Coates's back cover like a gold medal. But Coates's Baldwin turns out to be more like Richard Wright than virtually any before. Much of what this Baldwin would do, Wright had already done, from doubting that the journey to Black American freedom was assured, to measuring its distance in visceral experience. The hard-bitten epigraph from Baldwin that Coates inserts before the last section of Between the World and Me could have been the closing line of one of Wright's racial apocalypses. And that line is, "And they have brought humanity to the edge of oblivion because they think they are white." And here comes the last paragraph. Bowing to the urgency of Black Lives Matter, Coates returns Baldwin to the beautiful struggle by blunting his struggle with Richard Wright. In the process, he beats Baldwin's words back into swords by squashing two kinds of family drama. In one moment of the operation, he frees the history of mid-century Black literary modernism from the poorly aging dramaturgy of the Baldwin versus Wright deathmatch. In the other moment, he restores Baldwin to the multi-generational fold of African-American writing as a productive senior, which was Wright's original role for Baldwin, rather than a prodigal son. Coates's Jimmy is Wright's peer as the father, but not the daddy of us all. No longer the great bohemian artist as ego-shattering lover, but the good male elder of sound advice and dependable habits. All obvious differences aside, Coates joins contemporaries Rachel Gonsa, Darryl Pinckney, and Jesmyn Ward in sanding down Baldwin's sharp edges of intellectual pride, anxious rivalry, and sexual self-assertion, the features that stamped him indelibly, or so Baldwin himself insisted, as a very tight, tense, lean, abnormally ambitious, abnormally intelligent, and hungry black cat. Right? That's when he's speaking back to Norman Mailer in a famous essay. All these Baldwinists, moved by Black Lives Matter, prepared Jimmy for renewed battle by forgiving old differences and closing extended family ranks. Paying him reverence while mending fences with Richard Wright, they restyled a contentious ancestor as an elder minister of racial cohesion, giving the last word on the Wright-Baldwin debate, so to speak, to Baldwin, but largely in Wright's image and honor. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill and Donald. Those were inspiring, very meaty talks, a lot to think about. I guess I want to open up the floor for discussion at this point. So you can raise your virtual hand, you can raise your actual hand, you can put your name in the chat if you want to speak. Yeah, Keith, you got your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Thank you both for these wonderful presentations. This is really exciting for me. I just finished reading Richard Wright's The Man Who Lived Underground, and I'm thinking about that novel in various ways, hoping to get an essay out of that sooner or later. Anyway, what the thing I was thinking about in both following both presentations was this idea of what is the place of criticism among Black intellectuals, Black writers, Black artists, because there's a long history of that. I'm thinking of, Du Bois in Washington, or Du Bois and Alain Locke. I'm thinking about Hurston and Wright, which hopefully somebody or one of you guys will address that. I'm thinking of Baraka, Baldwin, and Ellison. I'm thinking about June Jordan and Barbara Christian, and as well as Wanda Coleman and Maya Angelou. And these rivalries, many of them were made public. And I remember when I was in graduate school, the big hubbub around the Wanda Coleman, Maya Angelou dust up. Maybe some of you remember that. I don't know if you do. But I was wondering, I think it was Bill who mentioned this idea of closing ranks, so that these sort of rivalries don't seep into the
Right.
public discourse. And I think this is a book, probably for someone who's a much younger scholar than I am, a book waiting to happen, to really examine these various rivalries or these various disagreements among these important writers and artists and thinkers, Black writers, artists, and thinkers. So my question is, what is the place? Anybody, but particularly Donald and Bill, what do you think the place is of these kinds of criticisms and rivalries among these very important African American literary and cultural scholars?
Well, do you want me to throw something in?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Bill, and then
Oh,
Joe.
sorry. Well, like obvious, I don't, just from through the screen of my own identity, I'm probably not the best person to answer this question when it comes to questions of community belonging and feeling present in a certain definition of the intellectual tradition. But I can say what I believe as a literary historian is that one of the things that makes the Harlem Renaissance the definitive modern movement in African American literary history is that contentions among Black literary intellectuals become the public business of American literary culture generally, right? So you have the Schuyler's debate with Hughes and so many others, and those are staged in public, in a sense, interracial literary spaces, right? And there's a way in which, if you're going to be a modern intellectual slash, contemporary author, staging serious debate is a way you prove your bona fides. It's a way in which you talk about the fact that an entire tradition can't be defined through one head writer in charge, which is another basic principle of the Harlem Renaissance. So I think there are significant relationships between the way that the Harlem Renaissance self-advertised a Black literary modernity and the staging of these conflicts, which you can see as folks tearing each other down. You can also see it as folks advertising each other as serious contestants for intellectual authority.
Joe?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Deb. So no, really, really great opening question, Keith. Good to see you here.
Thanks,
I mean,
Joe.
to add to your list, I think you could also say Wright's, blueprint for Negro writing, right? And its kind of characterization of a kind of new Negro movement in a particular way, right, is, could also be seen in this vein. And of course, on the Wright-Hurston kind of polemics, they're kind of mutually harsh and unfair reviews of one another's like books in around 37, 38. Of course, we could ask. Bill already gave a talk, but for those who haven't read his chapter on the ends of the Hurston Wright debate, I think would be well suited to do so in New Negro Old Left, right? I mean, one thing I really appreciate about Bill's work in that context, so it's been a while since I've read it, and I feel like there's echoes of it today, is it's just kind of saying like, listen, you actually read these writers, not just their polemics, and you see that they're actually reading each other, signifying off of each other, and to some degree, at least his, open to a deconstruction of this kind of hard binary that's been kind of instantiated in generations of critical studies too, right? Kind of a Wright school and a Hurston school, and I think you could probably map a similar kind of thing in this Baldwinist study, right? That Bill's kind of inaugurating. So I think that's that would just to add to that. I mean, I think doesn't Gary Holcomb have a piece too where he talks about Wright kind of misreading McKay? Like Claude McKay, kind of like there were some communists in the Harlem Renaissance too, right, Richard? Right, So I mean,
Gary would be saying that as often as possible.
Gary would be saying that, and I think Deb. I mean, I would just welcome you. I know you're the moderator here, but having read the draft of not the draft, the final version of your forthcoming book, you have some very interesting things to say too, which I won't try to preempt too much, but to say but just to welcome you since the moderator to step in as a speaker if you want. Your thoughts on which Baldwin gets lifted up, right? Since Baldwin did have kind of nuanced and evolving views of Wright, even if he didn't maybe ever make amends. The question of later critics, what voices in these debates get kind of hypostatized or frozen in time, right? So we end up even reading people's first comment on each other as if it's more authoritative than their fifth, and what's and how can we kind of change that or kind of rehistoricize those debates instead of freezing them in time, right? I'll just leave it there.
Great, thank you. Donald?
Yes, no, thank you. I just wanted to briefly comment. Definitely would love to hear you from you, Deb. But I was just thinking in response. I mean, I definitely can't comment on every one of those beefs in particular. But I would just say to pick up where Joe left off in terms of the first comment sometimes getting picked up on and not necessarily the fifth. I can think about an example. I always think about Hurston and Wright in this regard because in the 50s, they both praise each other. If you read Which Way for the NAACP, she's praising Black power and Wright's understanding of Black leadership via Kwame Nkrumah. And then Wright praises her in 60 in the position of the Negro artist and intellectual, his last speech. She just dies, and he says, her essay, The Pet Negro System, is one of the best essays historicizing, Black American literature and the various white philanthropists and all the things that are set up in regards to who chooses who. And so a lot of times we focus on 37 and 38 with the reviews back and forth, but we don't focus on when they come back around. And so I definitely think there's a lot to be said, of course, for the different disagreements and tensions, and they definitely can be productive many times. But I sometimes wish we wouldn't always stop there or focus on, like I said, I think, there were just some rich relationships. I mean, Ellison and Wright's letters are some of the most beautiful letters ever,
Yeah.
but we mainly deal with the world and the jug, and Richard couldn't imagine bigger. It's just,
Yeah.
I'm more prone to think about the friendships and the productivity of the friendships and the mentorships and what they provided. Whereas, of course, you can't get anywhere without dissension and arguments as well,
Right.
which also
That's right.
push people to new levels.
Right.
So
it reminds me of also Baraka later on, his early criticism of Baldwin and Ellison, but later on, like he was at Baldwin's funeral,
Yeah.
the praise of the funeral. So you're absolutely right. We oftentimes get fixated on that first moment of criticism, and we're unable or refuse to move beyond that to see that these cats are young, right? When a lot of times when they're saying these things, and then later on, as they get through life's experiences and really start to understand themselves as writers and intellectuals and the people around them, that's when we see this change.
Yeah.
I think
And
it's,
I would just say
well,
that, I'm sorry, let me just make a couple of points, Bill. One is that, I think there are rivalries and competition among all authors and all creative people. And so this idea of closing ranks among African-American writers seems to me, I can understand why the question arises, but it also seems that there's something that is, not limited certainly to that group of writers. I also think, in response to your question, Keith, about Donald's comment about the sons and father relationships that aren't highlighted, that we don't know very much about, that were very loving and very close, and where, somebody like Wright really mentored these young people, and there wasn't a rivalry. And to me, part of what we need to be looking at are both the sort of historical timeline that these competitions or criticisms take place in. So if you go from the 1930s, and this is a radical moment in American history and world history that Wright is shaped by, Baldwin is 16 years younger than him. He is not shaped by the same forces that Wright is. And if you go into the 1950s, I would contend that Baldwin is really being shaped by the Cold War in a way that makes him very critical of Wright, and that he is in service of the United States State Department and other agencies that are pushing him, and maybe not consciously, but that he's writing these criticisms in that context of the Cold War ideologies that are taking place. And Bill, I love your take on Ta-Nehisi Coates and the triangulation between the three writers. I'm not sure that I see that, though. It seems to me that Baldwin has really been, become the avatar of the contemporary civil rights movement of Black Lives Matter. And that Wright, even though he's come into, there's been more discussion about him, the real moment in recent history, just a few years ago, when The Man Who Lived Underground was published, the full novel, was when critics who had formerly been very critical of Wright and really damning, including Ta-Nehisi Coates. I mean, maybe you can read Between the World and Me as somehow elevating Wright, but that wasn't my take on the book, really. And it was the publication of the novel, the complete novel, that saw all these sort of, critics rethinking their attacks on Wright. And I thought, oh, this is great. And I was working on a book on Wright at that moment, and I thought I should publish this book really quickly because this is the moment to publish it. And in a way it was, because I feel like that has now moved on. And, again, Wright has kind of disappeared from public consciousness. And I think it's important to bring him back into the conversation. And not to in any way dismiss Baldwin or you know, dethrone Baldwin. I think Baldwin's really important too, but they represent very different
Right. Well,
perspectives.
just I have to say my screen is lagging here a bit. I don't know if other people's are as well, but just to respond what Deborah was saying, I don't think that people have read Between the World and Me as a triangulation of the debate or an elevation of Richard Wright, but I think they should, because that's what it actually does. So there's a separate thing there. But what we don't have now is the equivalent of this. This is a James Baldwin votive candle. We do not have a sort of cultural embrace of Richard Wright as an avatar of all of Black literary history, an avatar of the Black Lives Matter movement, an avatar of the entire tradition of Black queer theory and Black queer life and the presence of Black queer people within freedom struggles. So I'm not saying in any way that Wright has had it good in recent years. I'm just saying it's really ironic that one of the books that is most responsible, perhaps, for elevating Baldwin actually places these two figures in the same plane, right? So that was my claim anyway, trying to read that subtly. And just back to the question of not emphasizing the earliest moments, if you read Baldwin's 3 essays on Richard Wright, substantially about Richard Wright, Everybody's Protest novel, which is the most famous, barely talks about Richard Wright. In fact, it literally doesn't mention his name. It only mentions the name of Native Son, and it's the last 3 paragraphs of the essay that tack it on to a larger attack on Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was literally Baldwin's favorite book as a child. So that's interesting. Then a more substantial critique comes, I think it's 2 years later, in Many Thousands Gone, which is a great, far-ranging essay about Black music and so much else. But there, I think that, oh, go ahead, sorry. Anyway, there Baldwin really does attach Wright to a literary history that involves proletarianism, that involves, he doesn't talk about it in these terms, but he's talking about the history of the labor movement in relationship to the Communist Party. There really is a broad critique of Wright and his position there. But then by the final essay that deals with Richard Wright, by the time of that, which is 1961, Alas, Poor Richard, one of the first things Baldwin says in this essay is that some of Wright's work is a masterpiece. The Man of All Work. It's in part a review of 8 Men. It ends with some harsher comments, but even in these famous essays dealing with Baldwin, they represent a kind of dialectical progression through an understanding of who Richard Wright would be. We tend to concentrate on those final 3 paragraphs in Everybody's Protest novel, but this story is more complicated, obviously.
Yeah, I want to call him Jamil, but I'll just say very quickly that it's because that essay, Everybody's Protest novel, is the one that everybody looks at now. It's become iconic, and it is what the public sees as the criticism, right? Well,
thank you all. You know that moment when you raise your hand earlier and then like you hear 4 or 5 more comments and you forget what you were gonna say, but you want to respond to everything you heard? That's kind of where I am right now. If I have the timeline correctly, and I think Donald might be able to correct me if I'm wrong, just quickly responding to Bill, I think Baldwin and Wright were arguing in the cafe about the first essay.
Yes, yeah.
After the argument, Baldwin decides to then go attack Wright even further in response to their first fight.
Yeah.
So the second one is more concentrated on Wright because now he is actually intentionally trying to tear down Wright, which he necessarily wasn't trying to do in the first, I believe. And so I kind of look at that essay a little funny, a little petty. But I do know that what I wanted to start off by saying was it actually feels really great to be in a Richard Wright circle, because as someone in religion and in theology, I am constantly surrounded by Baldwin people. And so Wright often reduced to the footnote of Baldwin's elevation, and he's not necessarily taken on his own terms. And so a lot of our interpretations of Wright, or the massive interpretations of Wright across the public, is based off of Baldwin's reading. And one of the things that makes me so upset about that is Baldwin reviews Wright just like he reviews everyone else in his early career, which is he's never really talking about. He's reflecting on something else, using the novel to talk about what he wants to talk about, but reduces all other books and intellectuals and ideas to something going on with him, which he's much more transparent about later on. I do want to say I don't like framing them as a rivalry. I actually miss this era. I didn't live in it, but I actually miss when criticism was honest, when criticism was truthful about how other people felt about other people's work and ideas, because the ideas and the work was so central. It wasn't the personalities and the relationships necessarily. In fact, I think the only rivalry that I would even categorize is Hughes and Baldwin. Like, they barely wrote on each other, but when they did, it was something that seemed to be really reductive and petty.
Mhm.
I think Baldwin said that Hughes has all the talents of any poet in the world, but he's never used it. And Hughes said about Baldwin, "Go Tell It on the Mountain" is a nice story in a velvet bag, right? It was just something that had nothing to do with criticism, but I think that might be the only place I could find some sort of rivalry, so to speak, if one were to use that phrase. But again, actually going back to something Donald said, I see Wright much more in Giovanni's room than I see him in Go Tell It on the Mountain. Especially the climax of the tale when Giovanni ends up killing not Jacques, but the other character. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. Right. But so this rage that is inside of Giovanni, this desire to flee, this desire to rebuild a new life, Bigger sees the cross on the minister and sees it burning in flames. Giovanni sees the cross, spits on it, and takes it off after his wife is not able to have the baby. He kills his boss, who's been abusing him and trying to make it seem like he was stealing from him, and decides to flee from the police until the French police end up catching him. I find Baldwin using a lot of Wright's motifs and kind of plot lines in his early life in ways that have not been explored and in ways that Wright has not been given credit for. Baldwin gets to say that Richard Wright has accepted a theology that denies him life, and everything is reducible to violence, and Dick is trying to heal the world one murder at a time, when Baldwin's novels, especially the early ones, are filled with moments of violence and murder and police and fleeing and all these different aspects. And so, again, it feels good to be in a Richard Wright circle where I can say this and not feel like I'm attacking an icon or a hero or a saint. Okay, thank you all. Bye.
This.
That was also true of The Man Who Lived Underground and Ralph Ellison. Just throwing that in.
Just to say briefly, I'm pretty sure, Jamal, this is who I'm thinking. You wrote a piece on Wright and Religion, right? I'm pretty sure I've cited that piece, man. That's a great work. And I think people don't talk about Wright's relationship to his grandmother, Seventh-day Adventism, enough. The historicizing the radical nature of Seventh-day Adventism vis-a-vis, I forget the woman's name, Ellen White, I think, is the one who came down to Mississippi and spread it and faced lynch mobs. And it's a lot. You could argue that Wright's critiques of white supremacy are rooted in his grandmother's radical Seventh-day Adventism faith before the Sedition Act, because of the radical nature of Black Seventh-day Adventists in Mississippi. If you look at their pamphlets, their booklets, etc. And so I think there's a lot to be said for, and his grandmother and his aunt, who went to Oakwood, the HBCU Seventh-day Adventist school, they wanted him to be a preacher, which is, we hear that with Baldwin. And of course, Baldwin actually became a preacher, so it's different. But Wright was pushed to become a preacher. And he knew that, and he read scripture because he had to with his family. So I think I love your piece, and then I think there's so much more that we can build off of what you're doing with Wright and Religion. So, so shout out to the piece. If you all haven't read it, it's a good piece.
Joe.
Yeah, could we get a link or the name of the piece in the chat? That would be great. I just want to encourage other folks to use that chat box to share work, your own, others that you think is relevant. Really, please don't be shy about that. And I just so much on the table here. I'll just try to keep make one brief comment. One is, I think, the essay, Memories of My Grandmother, Wright's essay, Memories of My Grandmother, which, is just absolutely fantastic and super interesting. And I mean, not to like pit one text against another, but I think it's more interesting than the novel, or definitely as interesting and deserves as much attention, and yet has not received as much attention as the novel. I want to say, Deb, in your forthcoming book, you really take Wright as a theorist of his own work, in his nonfiction and his critical writings very seriously, and I really appreciate that. And just I think that's going to deserve and going to really enrich our broader debate. But I mean, just to pick up on Donald, your point about Seventh-day Adventism, which I think is really fascinating. Right in that essay, right in the Memories of My Grandmother, kind of distinguishes his grandmother's version of Christianity from a lot of like the more middle class kind of conciliatory versions. Of course, he's still very critical, I think very dialectically critical of like the way in which her commitment to an otherworldly perspective like removes her from the world, but also gives her a thing she can use to resist the world at the same time. And that kind of dialectic of kind of resistance that risks kind of escapism at the same time as it kind of strengthens the will against forces beyond one's control. I think I see that all over Wright. I see it even in Bigger, and I think like that's why I dropped that quote after Jamal, your comment alluding to the kind of the crosses bursting to flame. Like, and I've written about this a bit recently, but like Bigger too is like still open to the possibility of faith, but he's just afraid his hopes will be crushed again. There is this dialectic of kind of openness to utopian, what we might call utopian possibilities, and the fear of the additional existential vulnerability that committing to that prospect of hope on Earth would really kind of the vulnerability, that new vulnerability, that deeper vulnerability that creates an oppressed subject. And I think that's just one thing of many that Baldwin's published writings on Wright misses. That even Bigger is still going through this kind of, if you want to call it a proto-existentialist kind of divide between, how can you sustain a kind of subjectivity or agency in a world that's constantly threatening to negate it, and I think that Bigger too is, there's a risk, I think, I'm not going to blame it all on Baldwin, but that I think a lot of popular notions of Bigger, and I think Coates probably falls in this too, kind of reduces the subjectivity of Bigger to a kind of flat depiction of monstrosity, right? As if it is a kind of deterministic novel. And I just think that really does an injustice to Native Son, let alone other work of Wright, from the early poems to the haiku. There's a kind of dialectic, I would say, of the tender and the tough that runs through a lot of Wright's work. And I don't know, Bill, this is partly what you're alluding to in your brief talk on like the way in which Coates is doing something very Wright-like at times in his treatment of like urban Black masculinity in a way that he isn't really acknowledging Wright fully for doing. But I think that kind of contradictory subjectivity of oppression is all over Wright, and it's one thing that a Baldwinist reading of Wright is not going to, it risks losing. That wasn't particularly short, but anyway, I do appreciate this discussion. It's great. And I just encourage folks to just jump in. You don't have to be commenting on the talks per se. Like if you have other directions you want to take this, we originally conceived of this event as just like a time to pay tribute and talk broadly. So don't feel like you need to have a linear kind of connection if you want to open up a new line of discussion here in the time we have left. Thank you.
For our Richard Wright Circle, our Richard Wright Society. Anita.
Thank you. This is a fantastic discussion and I'm learning a lot. And I guess this just is partly a response to Donald's comment about the importance of thinking about mentorship. Wright was just such an incredible mentor. I'm thinking right now of his mentorship of Gwendolyn Brooks, in terms of, A Street in Bronzeville, but also Brooks's admiration for Native Son and the Chicago groups that Wright helped to generate and so on. I'm just wondering, this has to do with my own ignorance, is Baldwin known for being a mentor to any of his, to another well-known writer? And I'm just curious.
I can answer at least one person that I know, Susan Laurie Parks. She studied under James Baldwin, and she mentions him many times in various context interviews, how she wanted to be a novelist or a short story writer, but he read her work and basically said, no, you're a playwright. And she says that made all the difference in the world. So that's one person that I know of.
I'm going to say Wright's identity as a teacher of the young is something that really only firms up in his own conception of himself when he's an older man, and he's coming back almost every year in the mid-80s to teach at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst or Bowling Green, and that's where he meets Susan Laurie Parks and others. He was not, in certain ways, the most dependable teacher.
Right, right.
Largely his office hour began around midnight. But still, I mean, we tend to forget that version of Baldwin, right? Because we imagine him as this kind of brilliant bohemian sage, which he was. But he was literally an American college professor. He was part of the program era in the way in which, you know, the production of novel writing is moving into the university. And it's there, I think, that he feels a deep sense of responsibility to younger writers. He also, I mean, I think he saw one of his responsibilities was to not necessarily discipline, but to be a contender in the sense of someone who would argue seriously with the nature of your work. Right? He came out of a culture of dispute as well as a preaching culture. The left, and you know, when he's in high school in the 30s and early 40s, is riven by divisions between Trotskyites and Stalinists, and that's part of his heritage too. So I thought that, you know, for him, I think being a good mentor would also be someone who would go to town on your work. So
thank you. I'll also look up the Lorraine Hansberry connection too. Thanks.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks,
I
Anita.
want to say,
Well,
yeah, I want to say on the mentoring questions, they're both, in my opinion, vastly different in the sense that Wright and his mentoring he mentored artists who wanted to write art, regardless of their political positions and their thoughts. He wanted to, if you were a poet, if you were part of the negritude, he wanted to mentor artists. And so he has a large number of artists from across the diaspora, you know, US and West Africa who loved him, you know, who wrote notes about him and all of his leadership. Baldwin is a little different because time is not on his side in regards to the civil rights movement, Black Power era, right? He leaves and he goes to Paris, but then he tries to come back to be a part of the movement. So a lot of his mentoring attempts have to do with trying to build relationships with Black arts movement writers who either accept him or reject him. So he has a decent rapport with Maya Angelou. He has a decent rapport with Nikki Giovanni. He has a decent rapport with Toni Morrison, some of the women some of the women who we categorize in Black arts, whether we do so or not, but who come up in that time period. He has a great rapport with them, especially when he dies. We can read some of the eulogies that reflect on him, right? But also, Baldwin is probably literally eviscerated more than Wright is in this sort of time period when Baldwin is trying to serve as some sort of older grand figure in the 60s. I would have to say after Wright dies in 60 and Baldwin is trying to be, you know, a sort of father figure, mentor to young Black arts and Black nationalist writers, he's rejected as much as he is accepted, I would have to say.
And just a kind of footnote to the question that you raised, Anita, not so much in terms of actual mentorship, but in terms of the educational content of both writers' work. I think that they, you know, you think about the Baldwin's letter to his nephew, and that was obviously, you know, a letter to his nephew, but it was a letter to all those young men who would read that letter. And Wright, I think, in much of his work, you look at The Ethics of Living Jim Crow, is educating people. He understands his role as a writer in part to educate. And I think we see that in Baldwin as well throughout his work.
I just want to say a brief comment. It's one of the favorite, I think one of the best compliments Wright ever got is Peter Abrams, who wrote the South African novelist. And in the letters he wrote, Wright helped him get published with Harper Collins, the Harper and Brothers back then. But he says in one letter, he's like, you respond so quickly and with so much length to my letters. And for somebody as famous as you, this is like 47. So this is, you know, post-Black boy. He's the biggest writer ever. He hasn't fallen off just yet with The Outsider. And so he was like, I think your generosity is as important as the stuff you write. And I think I was like, wow, that's beautiful. Like, and I think it is. I mean, I think that your legacy is just as important in terms of how many people you helped to get to a level maybe they couldn't have got to without you is as important as the stuff you write. And I think about that a lot with just how we think about both Baldwin. I know Morrison, I don't know, again, if it was a mentorship, I know Morrison adored Baldwin and that, you know, that language, I forget the piece she wrote about his language and how much she loved it. But I think that stuff counts for a lot, you know, for both of them.
And there's also the Southside Writers Group, you know, in Chicago. And so, you know, all of the writers that were involved in that, including Margaret Walker, you know, were learning from each other, but Wright played a central role in leading that group. Yeah. Letitia.
Hi, thank you for an amazing discussion. It's always great to listen to the, you know, Baldwin and Wright groups. I did that at the ALA, and you know, I'm always coming back in awe. So I'm working on Langston Hughes, and I'm trying to also understand the complex relationships he had with some of these writers, Wright and Ellison in particular, because I remember that they didn't really agree with his take on, with his allegiance to, you know, communism, especially in the 50s. And so I was wondering, I know that Bill has written about this, and probably others know a lot more about this than myself. I was wondering, what do you make of the fact that, you know, they didn't really engage in a productive conversation about this topic, which was important for all of them at the time, because they all wanted, you know, to, of course, help the civil rights movement, the pre-civil rights movement, and to, you know, end racism and all that. And of course, so, I mean, Ellison and Wright, if I'm not mistaken, had been members of the Communist Party, and of course had their, you know, problems with the American Communist Party, and Hughes was not. And I tend to think that that's where the big, you know, difference of vision comes from. But I'd be curious, you know, what's your opinion, and how much do you think that this political disagreement affected their relationships? Because yes, as you said, I mean, none of these really saw in Hughes, you know, the at some point anyway, the you know, the really big literary figure that he was, and the model, and the you know, the father figure, so to speak. Thank you.
Great question, Letitia. Anybody want to respond?
I will just do something that's probably unfriendly in one way and very friendly in another, which is throw this over to Alan Wald, who may indeed know more about this particular question than anyone in the world. There are a few other candidates, so I don't know if Alan wants to speak, but this might be a good time. So there he is.
Am I muted or not?
No, we can hear you.
So, I mean, I think this is a great discussion. I've been taking a lot of notes. A lot of things that have been said, I hadn't even thought about, particularly the Giovanni's Room interpretation, really, because I've taught the novel several times, and that aspect that it could be dealing with Wright, that sounds like that's worth pursuing. On this question of the disputes, I mean, I think politics are important. I'm not quite sure I got this Hughes Wright thing. If Hughes was definitely a communist. He may not have been an official party member, but he was a communist, and I don't think he took Richard Wright's open break and attack very well. And I think he remained pretty much so pro-Soviet for a long time, maybe even into the 50s. So the dispute between them, I don't think is reducible to politics. I do think politics is central to the other disputes, though. I agree with Deborah that the critiques of Richard Wright by Baldwin in the 1950s have a lot to do with the movement of the Cold War away from left-wing literature. This attack on social protest literature is in a way a coded attack on proletarian literature and left politics in general. And Baldwin's take is not in isolation. I mean, generally Partisan Review and other publications were going in that direction. And as I think Bill pointed out, it's really Wright is just sort of tacked on at the very end of the first piece. That it's mainly an attack on social realist literature. And then he attacks Wright. Wright is pissed off. So he goes further in the next essay and so on. And then that third essay is really weird because, as has been pointed out, he says a lot of positive things about Wright, including the strange remark that Laud Today is Wright's best novel. We have to think about that because that was written when Wright was a communist. It is very much under the influence of Ulysses and Joyce, although I see some of that in Native Son too, and I think also in The Outsider. I think it's a remarkable novel that I don't think Baldwin ever came to grips with. I think it was just not in his purview. The last thing I'll just say is about these debates. I was on a faculty here at University of Michigan with two African-American faculty members who were involved in these kind of debates. Robert Hayden, as you recall, was viciously attacked by the Black Arts Movement and sort of went down in history as an opponent of the Black Arts Movement. And yet, when I came, he was the main mentor to Gail Jones, who was here for several years. She was hired the same time I was. Who I don't think would be seen as somebody opposed to Black arts. So the whole Hayden thing is very complicated. And I think that looking at that debate, which was political, you also have to look at the full trajectory. And the other figure, of course, is Harold Cruz, who was always embattled, especially after Crisis of the Negro Intellectual came out. He was called virtually an FBI agent and that critiqued by Julian Mayfield, an important Black writer who's been somewhat forgotten. So I think that what happens is that these debates are sort of created by the atmosphere, but certain figures come out to be the spokesperson for the mood, and I think that's happened with Baldwin at that particular moment. But actually, one thing that's not been mentioned is that the major attack that hurt Wright was the attack on him for misogyny, which had to do with the rise of Black women critics, Black women writers, Toni Morrison, and so on. I don't know that Wright has ever been recovered from that attack, there was an element of truth in it, but it was wildly exaggerated. And I think that hurt Wright the most. And that might be seen as sort of a parallel situation to the Baldwin critique in the 50s.
I'll just say, I think there are defenses of Wright against those attacks that he was misogynistic that are out there. And also, for Hughes and Wright and any conflict between them, Hughes visited Wright just before he died. He was there, I think, maybe the day he went to the hospital. I'm pretty sure he was there the day he went to the hospital. So if there was conflict between them, they remained friends. And Wright, I think is arguably, and most critics would agree with this, remains a Marxist. Throughout his life. He doesn't, he leaves the Communist Party, but he remains a Marxist. And I actually talked to one person who is the current chair of the US Communist Party, who said that he had heard a story that he was actually paying dues in Paris to the Communist Party when he was there. I don't have any other verification of that, but that's a story that was told to me and that, has some basis in fact, at least from one person's perspective. Donald.
Yeah, I was going to follow up on what you just said about the Hughes and Wright relationship. I mean, of course, he wrote the Last Days of Richard Wright, and him, Wright, Bontemps, and Hughes were about to start a network together to revive their relationship in the late 30s when Wright died. There definitely seemed to be a lack of at least I haven't found correspondence kind of like the 50s as much. Wright does kind of attack Native Son with the heroes piece in the Crisis, where he says we need more heroes. But I feel as if definitely by 1960, they're all three of them are trying to get back to that Chicago spirit of community again. But of course, Wright dies a couple of days after Hughes leaves, so they don't pick it up. But yeah.
I think we'll pause for just a minute. Allie, do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's been such a rich conversation. I wanted to hop in since we're coming up on the 1:30 mark and just make a couple of official, only official in that they're like businessy, I guess, announcements from Richard Wright Society land. First of all, thanks to everyone for such a rich conversation. This has given us so much to think about, and I think this reframing is so important just because these narratives kind of, as we pointed out, take on a life of their own. And so I think finding some new anchor points is so important. One thing I wanted to mention is that unless you tell me not to, I will add your email to the Richard Wright Society email list if you're not already on that, if you registered for today's event. So that you can be kept up to date. We promise not to write too often, but just to keep you posted on interesting online conversations or in-person events that you can participate in. So if you prefer not to be added to the list, you can email me and let me know that. I have my own email address, which is I think the one associated with this. I can put mine in the chat, but you can, I can also put the right email in the chat too. So here's mine, and then we also have rightsociety@gmail.com. Two other little teasers I'll mention. We plan to have one more event coming up this fall online, probably in November, to think about the state of Richard Wright studies in an international frame. I'm still sort of, we are, all of those of us who are involved in the Richard Wright Society, the kind of interim steering committee right now, still putting that together. And so if your voice would be one that you might be willing to add to that conversation, reach out and let us know that. Also in the spring, probably maybe in April, we'll be having an event to feature Deborah's forthcoming book. I wanted to be sure to mention that too. I got the title here and now it's minimized, so tiny I can't find it. Will you say it, Deborah?
No race, no country, the politics and poetics of Richard Wright.
Yeah, so that's forthcoming in the spring. So more events upcoming from the Richard Wright Society. We wanted to give you an off ramp at the 90-minute mark because I know it can be tricky to just hop off, but we're also happy to stick around and continue the conversation. If anybody has more time, it's been great. So thanks again to everybody.
And before everybody leaves, I just want to give a shout out to Allie, who revived the Richard Wright Society. And I think we really owe her a lot for having done that. So thank you, Allie.
My pleasure. It's been collaborative from the beginning. So definitely want to give credit to Joe and to T, to a lot of people who have, to people who aren't here, Shayna, Russell, to others who kind of been there from the beginning, blowing air on the spark, really, that was the Richard Wright Circle. So it's been my pleasure, but thanks to everyone. And thanks for being here today. And hope to see you again soon, and stay on if you can. Otherwise, catch you soon. See your face, T.
Just wanted to say greetings from Japan. Toru, thank you for being here with us. He was with us with the first, with his wonderful scholarship on Richard Wright haiku.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here. Thank you all for being
here.
Yeah,
thank you all.
And maybe, I don't know if we have the link handy, Ali, if we do, to our previous event on the haiku, where Toru gave such a great talk on the Wright's production process. We had a couple other talks on the haiku too.
Yeah, give me 1 minute. I'll get that link for you.
You have it. That would be great. We have done events, and hopefully we can help. We would love to employ you all as organizers to help spread the society. Once we have the link to the YouTube version of this event, please help share it with anyone you think could benefit from it after the event. not to close the discussion, but certainly to look ahead.
Organizers and
And-
presenters like Jamal, I would love to hear more of your thoughts on religion and Wright and Baldwin and other Black authors, and others of you, Keith, everybody who's present.
I'm sorry. Okay.
I know Almost is
And-
doing cool work
And
on
Jamal, were you going to put your essay in the chat, the link to your essay?
I think he did.
Did he?
I did.
Okay,
It's
I'll
in there.
check.
It's in
Okay,
there.
thank you.
No problem.
And we'll save the chat.
Yep.
And Jamal, I think you had something to say before I said we'd pause so people could get off. Do you remember what it was?
Oh, I did. I was like, what was I about to say? When I was doing my exams for my doctorate, my readers were Cornel West and Farrah Griffin. And one of the questions for my exams was about Richard Wright and women. And it was an oral exam, so I had to answer this in public. I think when it comes to Richard Wright and women, I'll say this quickly because I know people are logging off. I'm not so sure that Wright or Baldwin, because Trudy Harris has a book entitled "The Black Women in the Novels of James Baldwin." I'm not so sure in print that they're defensible. And the way to say, well, if you look at other chapters or pages, does he have a tension or issue with women? I believe in print that he does, and the only defense when it comes to Wright and women is the ones in his actual life. The mentees, the mentors, the friends, the people he wrote with and talked to, the friendships he had, the people remarked on. I think that's the only defense or any contribution to the concept of or the discussion around Richard Wright and gender, because Native Son and The Outsider are just kind of, especially for Black women, I think this is really the source of it. It's Richard Wright and Black women. I think that's where it's a little bit, that's where it's a little damning. So that's what I was going to comment on Richard Wright and women. Richard Wright and women, there can be some discussions about other characters. Suit and Bright Morning Stars, that is probably the only defense I could think of. The mother headed out trying to protect her son. But then you have, who is the wife and the story right before that? It's Bright and Morning Star.
Long.
Yeah, is it long? I can't remember the
All
story.
Black Song or
Black Song.
Well, there's Dan Taylor's wife, who is very hard to remember even by name, right? She's kind of pushed.
oh
over.
yeah, the Reverend one. Yeah.
But Long Black Song, you can make a argument that that's a more feminist take on her.
It's open for wider interpretations. I'm only trying to say that I think that as a Richard Wright lover, I think the Black women critics just have a stronger point, and the counters may not be as strong as the examples that they have for their position. That's all I'm trying to say.
Thank you, Jamal. And Joe, you wanted to say something, and then I'll say something.
Oh, I mean, I guess I'm starting to transition to thinking like organizer here too. I'm like listening, like what are the debates that are kind of, emerging here, or the propositions that might be subject to debate that we don't have time for now. And I think it would be really interesting to do a panel like this, maybe in the spring, if not the fall, on, Right and gender, or navigating perhaps Right and religion as well. I mean, I'm thinking basically, I just would like to welcome those of you who have stuck around for, after the formal, 90 minutes, to think, if you have not only an idea, but like a willingness to put in some energy and to share some work. Jamal, clearly you work on Right and religion. You have thoughts. And I know, Deb, you have some interesting things to say about the gender question too, from your recent book. Maybe we can be thinking about what are the debates that would draw folks in, that would be particularly productive, and even if they include acknowledging serious criticisms of Wright's work, right? It's not like we have to be the Richard Wright Promotion Society, right? I don't think we're afraid to get into the cracks and contradictions.
Marxism.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but I would also add, just to Jamal, we might also look at Wright's Harlem journalism. I think is an important, I don't want to say exception, but I think complicates the picture on a lot of the women a lot of the people he's writing about when he's talking about rent strikes and people fighting against the cost of milk and the organizing on the street in Harlem is focusing on Black women protagonists. And it also, I think, coincides with the shifting in how he even represents militancy more generally. So yeah, it'd be worth, but I don't want to do this in a defensive mold. Absolutely. There's some real limits there. And so how do we negotiate the question of someone changing over time and struggling and maybe
Right.
improving, but within kind of starting from, some codes that are pretty mired in some problems, right? So it's how do we track that without kind of whitewashing it, as it were. That's maybe something we can pick up later.
Yeah, I think the most feminist right is Pagan Spain. I would probably say the most the most feminist concern and questions and attention on women is actually Pagan. That's my opinion, or my read at the moment.
That's one of them. I think there's other works that you can look at, including A Man of All Work. Is that the title of the story?
Yeah.
He dresses up as a woman.
Mhm.
I think that's such a great story. And I think it's not like Baldwin liked that story because why did he like it? He liked it because it showed Wright as I can't even remember, but he did like the story. But I think the story is about Wright's feminist perspective, and that he understands when he dresses up what women have to go through. That he's attacked by this white guy who's attacking all of the house workers that they hire, and he has to dress up like a woman, and it's really hard, and he has to walk on those shoes, and that's really hard. And he's really recognizing the work that women do in that story in ways that I think are really interesting. I was just glad that Donald mentioned Black Hope too, which is an important book to look at, and I hope will eventually be published.
I have a quick question for the Wright scholars here. I was wondering, well, I read, like I said, I read The Man Who Lived Underground a couple of weeks ago, and the essay, subsequent essay, Memories of My Grandmother. And one of the things that, struck me as being really, really interesting is Wright's interest in surrealism, his interest in surrealist art, which he, I think, if I recall correctly, names Dali, Salvador Dali. He mentions him several places in that essay. When we think about James Baldwin, we usually think about in terms of artistic creation other than writing fiction writing. We think about the spirituals and the gospel music. When we think of Langston Hughes, we think about jazz and blues. And I'm sure there are blues, at least blues elements in Richard Wright, but we usually don't associate him very much, or at least as much as Hughes and Baldwin with Black music. I was wondering if some of you, the more seasoned Wright scholars, could talk about Wright's relationship with art, particularly surrealism, and also music.
I'll just say one thing about music is that, at the end of his life, partly because he wasn't getting published and he was desperate to make some money, he was writing liners for albums. And I don't know how many he wrote, but that was, something that he did, and he did well, and he got permission to do.
I was going to add. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Bill. I seen you tried to chime in.
No, that's all right. No, that's okay. I was going to say that, just on the other side of the fence, Baldwin is pretty thoroughly allergic to surrealism and many forms of European avant-gardism. I mean, his vision of high modernism comes out of Henry James and somehow mingles Henry James with King James, right? In the rhythm of sentences. But, there's that scene in Another Country at the end of the novel where the two partners in an affair decide to confront each other at the Museum of Modern Art. It's one of the least sympathetic descriptions of that museum and its abstractions that you could ever imagine. So anyway, yeah. But I mean, Baldwin's relationship to music is so fundamental. I mean, just the names of the novels. He was going to call Giovanni's Room One for My Baby after the Frank Sinatra Torch ballad, I mean, that's how thoroughly, and so many of the names are going. And just the detail about him that's fascinating to me. He had a pretty good voice, kind of in the baritone register. He liked gospel. He would sing gospel with his brother David. And he recorded it several times, not just once. Take My Hand, Precious Lord, right? The Thomas Dorsey classic. Love Mahalia Jackson's version of that, right? But a recording of that song was literally played at his funeral. So he eulogizes himself with Take My Hand, Precious Lord in the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. It's booming out people find it like this almost disturbing visitation of his spirit. But his relationship to Black gospel traditions, spiritual traditions, blues and jazz is just so deep. And somebody out on the West Coast, a young curator, has actually on Spotify created a registry of all the albums in Baldwin's collection that were discovered in his house in St. Paul de Vence. So it's many, many hours. And it's everything from like, you know, really hardcore gospel to some contemporary disco stuff. You like Donna Summer. It's fascinating. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm getting in the weeds, but it's look it up on Spotify. So
Keith, to your question, one place to look that hasn't been mentioned is the later pages of 12 Million Black Voices. Wright's discussion of not both the kind of conditions of emergence of kind of Black music in the urban setting in particular, his kind of reading of it and kind of dialectically as both kind of, you know, as kind of what it comes out of, but what also prefigures, but also its ability, you know, the fact that even white racists end up singing the songs, the kind of contagious nature of Black music gets a really, really interesting treatment. I'm looking at it here. It's like pages like 125. I was going to read a passage, but there's actually more than I could do, but it's like 125 to 130. I'll just read like one line from it, which is towards the end of the discussion. But he says, "We live on and our music makes the feet of the whole world dance, even the feet of the children of the poor white workers who live beyond the line that marks the boundary of our lives. Where we cannot go, our tunes, songs, slang, and jokes go." Right. And he kind of talks about the ways in which Black proletarianization like has a kind of appeal beyond, you know, Black people itself. It's a pretty remarkable reflection. And again, it's not what maybe people have been taught to look for and write, but it's definitely there. So that's one place I would definitely look.
Donald?
I was going to add to Keith a couple of points. He was very good friends with Leadbelly. And he wrote that Daily Worker piece on Leadbelly. You know, Ellison's review of Black Boy, you know, roots Black Boy in the blues tradition. And that's where that famous definition of the blues is personal catastrophe expressed lyrically. And then I think more on a more personal level, what he liked listening to was, I guess you would call it like, you know, Chitlin Circuit blues. You know the Chitlin Circuit.
Yeah.
I remember I was reading his journals in the Beinecke, and he was talking to this Black guy who lived out who was born and raised in Seattle, Michael Carter, who was a good friend of his at the time in New York. I think his name was Michael Carter, but he was like, he didn't like the blues I played, but then he was like, I forgot he wasn't raised in the South and he was with like mainly bourgeois white people, so he doesn't listen to like the low down stuff that I like. And he was like, these people that didn't grow up in the Black Belt, you know, like me, they don't listen to that Chitlin Circuit stuff, and they didn't grow up on it in the same way. And I thought that was interesting, that like, you know, it makes sense, it tracks. So
yeah.
It's interesting. I mean, the Wright that Baldwin liked the most on the level almost of personal chemistry was the one that was most connected to Mississippi in his mind. Right. I mean, he talks about that in some pretty offensive ways, actually. But he says, you know, Wright was a boy of that era and that place. That's what he says, you know, and that's where they connected, you know. Anyway.
He calls him a pickaninny, doesn't he?
He does. Yeah.
Wow.
Fortunately, yeah.
I wanted to give a quick shout out. I know y'all mentioned Toru. If I'm not mistaken, you edited the documented chronology, right, of Richard Wright? Because if people haven't read that work, that's a monumental work. Like, but I know he's done he probably knows more about Wright than all of us. I mean, I don't know how long that took, but that's a crazy, yeah.
So helpful.
Yeah, it's so helpful. Yeah.
What was it called? What's the book?
It's just a documented chronology of Richard Wright. I mean, I'm sure he could describe it better than I could, but yeah, it just goes through pretty much everything from birth to death in a very encyclopedic manner.
And you can get an electronic copy now, so you can search for things in it. It was just, I referred to it all the time. That work that was done, has been done on these scholars is just remarkable.
Just another note to throw in is, we were talking earlier about how gender, at least implicitly, may have informed relationships between Wright and Baldwin. Oh, there it is. Okay. This gentleman's got it. We haven't talked about the way sexuality impacts this too. And, Baldwin, at least, for his part, saw homophobia in Wright, a complicated kind of homophobia, thought it certainly impacted their relationship. Of course, Baldwin is talking about that in very encoded forms, but it's interesting to me that on the question of gender, at least, I think maybe Baldwin is equally, let's just say, suspect early on. It's not an accident that he's trying to insult Wright by comparing him to the great white, grandmother of sentimental writing in the 19th century, pairing them like mirror images of each other, like photographic negatives of each other. I think in a certain way, Baldwin is attempting to unman him by doing that. So they fought out questions of manhood on the ground of sexuality as well.
As if Wright hadn't already done that to himself in right,
exactly.
Right, in How Bigger Was Born, and I think a very maybe unfair, right, self-criticism, right, as if in terms of Uncle Tom's Children versus, or at least the as I would distinguish, the 1938 version of Uncle Tom's Children before the edition of Bright Morning Star, I think is really the version he's criticizing in that essay, and that's a distinction I think needs to be marked more clearly. But yeah, it's like, did Baldwin, even acknowledge that self-criticism on Wright's part? If he had, how would that affect
probably not
his critique, right?
Well, and also Margaret Walker said he was queer. That there have been a lot of really interesting essays written about that, saying, well, not necessarily that he was homosexual himself, he wasn't gay, and I don't think that he was, but he had a queer sensibility, and he exerted that in his writing, both in his fiction and I think in his nonfiction. And, I guess along with that, related to that is sort of this double voicedness is what I was calling it, that, a lot of times, especially because of the Cold War, he had to conceal what he was really saying by almost saying it's inverse. But then there would be a moment, and you see this in Black Power, for example, his book on the Gold Coast, where he would say, yeah, but that probably won't happen. And Western imperialism, if it doesn't, change, this is going to be the consequence of it. And so you begin to see how he's playing with these, kind of trickster voices.
And on the issue of queerness, I mean, Donald probably has seen this working through the drafts of Black Boy, or Black Confession, as it was called. In the early drafts, there's lines that don't make it into the published version. He literally talks about a queer hunger as an essential feature of the human condition, and by which he means that people, including himself, will, and this does survive in some form in the published version, will at times give up food for a cause, like that he would go hungry in order to spend time doing things he wanted. There are things to a human being more important than just like bare sustenance, right? And this notion that we have a kind of perversity in us, right, that we can make other causes more important than what our animal needs. And so he literally calls that a queer hunger at the heart of kind of the human condition. I don't think that phrase makes it into print anywhere that I'm aware of, but it's in the early drafts of Black Confession, and very, I think of pretty significant in terms of thinking about the contradictions of human subjectivity and how to navigate them, and the opportunities, right? The potential of kind of acknowledging that complexity. So it's pretty fascinating.
It's also a theme that comes up in The Long Dream, and some of the scenes in that book.
It's interesting because Wright is not known for writing back in public against Baldwin's critiques, right? They're in this personal history. But in Island of Hallucination, right? I think that Donald was talking about that earlier. There is a really vicious takedown of not just a homosexual, but a sadomasochistic Baldwin in that book. There's a character called Mechanical. It is, Bessie is treated better than Mechanical is, I think it's fair to say. And I think that one of the reasons that this book has not been published, though it's a completed novel, it's not his best work. I mean, you can get it at the Beinecke. Some of you folks have read it, is because there may be a libel suit from the Baldwin estate or for someone. I mean, I don't know if that's literally possible. I don't know if you can be convicted of libeling the dead, but it's a remarkably vicious attack on James Baldwin, as if everything has been stored for generations.
I was wondering how much credence should or do you, those of you who have written a lot about Wright, how much credence do you attribute to Margaret Walker and her take or understanding on Richard Wright? I've heard or read a number of critical pieces, sort of blasting her for the way she frames Richard Wright in her book, and the way she paints him as a person and as a writer, as an intellectual. I was wondering what you guys thought about what Margaret Walker and her relationship was to Richard Wright.
I'm not going to answer this question directly. I'll just say I love Margaret Walker. I probably like her writing more than Wright's, ironically enough. Jubilee's probably my favorite novel. I love her poetry. I mean, she taught my dad at Jackson State. Like, I absolutely love Margaret Walker.
Wow.
I think her letters to Richard Wright before they fell out, I think they were the best of friends. Like, I think if you read their letters, the intimacy, I don't mean like intimacy in terms of like romantically, but just the friendship is beautiful if you just read their letters in which they talk about their love for the South, boxing, family, etc. I mean, I think she was bitter. I mean, I think that's
She's in love with him.
Yeah, she admits it. So I mean, I think that's definitely I think she was bitter. She was in love with him, and it wasn't returned in the way she wanted it to be. And she thinks she admits it in her journals. She admits it in her journals. And like you look at those, I think it's when they fell out in 38 or 39, whenever it was at the Congress she went to, and she visited them in New York, and she didn't, like she talks about it in the journal. So it's tough. Like for me personally, as somebody who probably sees, I love her because she stayed in Mississippi and taught people like my dad.
Yeah.
In a way where I actually will never respect Wright. Not to say, you can't leave Mississippi, but like she stayed and did the hard work of loving like the state that so many people left. But it's tough, It's tough though. The biography is tough. Yeah.
But even though it's I think she's wrong on a lot of things, and I think it's hard to read. I don't think it's very well written, the biography, but it's useful. I mean, I was happy to read it. I got a lot out of reading it, and she gives information about Wright because she was close to him that you don't get from other writers, other biographers. Like the book that he asked her to read, that he gave her to read. He gives her a whole book list that help educate her, particularly on Marxism, and that kind of information is priceless. I think we're done. It's 2:58 Eastern time.
Okay.
That's a pause.
It's time for lunch.
Time for lunch. Thank you, Deb, for moderating so beautifully. Thank you, Bill and Donald, for your contributions, and everyone else for contributing to such a good.
Thank you guys so much. I learned so much. I really did. It's wonderful.
Donald and Bill, I really, really enjoyed your talks. I'm so glad this has been recorded.
Yes, I'm gonna put timestamps on it, and I'll share it. It may take me a few days to get to that, but I'll be sharing it soon. So.
And will you share the chat too?
I will share the chat. Yep, I've saved it. I'll save it here as the last thing. So, but thanks everyone. A real pleasure. So
thank you guys.
More soon. Okay.
If you're anybody going to MLA, I may see you there. So it's in New Orleans.
Yeah, congratulations.
Might be fun. So,
Okay,
right.
more soon. Thanks. Take
nice
care.
to meet
everybody.
you all. Cheers.
Likewise.
Bye.
All right.
Cheers.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you so
Thank
much.
you.
Cool.
Do it
Bye-bye,
again
everybody.
soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Right, Allie,
Thank
thanks
you.
for
Thank you, Deb. Thank you, Joe. It's good to,
This was
yeah, this
great.
was great. Super great. And to save this as the last step. I don't know whether if you've saved it once, it saves the whole thing automatically or if it just saves where you saved it, but
that's a good question. I just saved it too, but it's good to have it in.
Yeah.
If you save the recording,
Yep.
the chat.
I've got it recorded. Oh, does it say?
We'll save the chat. You'll be able to download
Oh,
the
okay.
chat.
Okay.